Hey, it's Zach. I just wanted to pop on before the episode begins. And first off, thank you for listening to Video Oblivious. It's been amazing to see how many people have enjoyed this podcast so far, and I am having a blast doing it. So thank you for being part of our audience. I certainly appreciate it. Second, I just wanted to let you know that this episode was taped a little bit out of order. We taped this one before the Lethal Weapon episode with Sebastian that came out back on December 18th. And that's because I didn't know Lethal Weapon was a Christmas movie until I watched it. So I decided to move that one up into the order before Christmas and push this one off until January 8th. So just in case something sounds weird, maybe I say something about it being December or something coming up in early January, just that's so you'll have context and know that this was taped almost a month ago now. Here we go. Enjoy the episode.
I'm a friend of Sarah Connor. I was told that she's here. Could I see her, please?
No, can't see her. She's making a statement.
Where is she?
Look, it may take a while. You want to wait? There's a bench over there.
I'll be back.
I'm Zach Bennett. I was born in 1981, but somehow I missed out on seeing the greatest movies of the 1980s. So I'm fixing that. I'm going to watch these great films and talk about them with my friends who have loved them for decades. This is Video Oblivious. Episode 5, 1984's The Terminator. All right, this time around, I am talking to Keith Conrad about The Terminator. Keith, hi, how are you?
Hi, Zach. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being on. So Keith and I worked together for, I guess it was only like 6 months we actually worked together, and that was almost 15 years ago, but we've kept in close touch.
It was the best 6 months of my career.
I'm sure it was. But we've kept in close touch since then. Still friends. And you are up in Chicago and I'm here in Nashville. So we're doing this long distance. But yeah, tell me a little bit about yourself, about where you grew up and family situation, what kind of stuff you were into as a kid, that sort of thing.
Well, I grew up in the Chicago area. My dad was a rocket scientist. And so that ultimately led us to Huntsville, where I spent, probably about half of my formative years, and then into college. And then actually the day after the 2000 presidential election, the local radio station there in Huntsville gave me a job, running the board and things like that. And did that in college. And then after that, I was kind of off to the races doing radio shows kind of all around the country, and finally settled back into Chicago, which is where I kind of always wanted to end up. And I've been here ever since. And since 2016, I've been doing, my own independent, freelance editing and production business. And actually, in January, I'm launching with a former colleague a sci-fi audio drama podcast, which is going to be a lot of fun.
Hey,
and doing a couple other things for clients and stuff like that.
Sounds fun. So you grew up kind of a split between Chicago and Huntsville, but you have one brother, correct? Am I right on that?
I do have one brother. He's a couple years older than me, and he and the rest of the family actually still live in Huntsville.
Okay. No other siblings, just you guys. So you're pretty close. Did he have anything to do with your love of the Terminator?
The Terminator, I wouldn't say. Well, yeah. Actually, I think because you and I saw them in the same order, because I saw Terminator 2 first.
Yeah,
and which probably is actually the case for a lot of people. Not quite like so many years apart the way it ended up being for you, but. Kind of the same thing where that was the big movie in 1992. Yeah. And so a ton of people saw that one first. He is definitely the person who introduced me to that. And then it was probably a few years later that I saw the first one.
So I saw Terminator 2 when I was probably, when it came out in 91, 92, somewhere around there. And it was, so I was 10 when it came out, or right about 10 years old.
Mhm.
And I'm right at that age where I'm really craving just violent movies. And so all my friends are talking about Terminator 2. And so I saw Terminator 2 as a kid, and I didn't really understand what was going on. I just knew it was just, a very, very violent film that I probably should not have been watching at that age. And I may have seen it a time or two since then in the 90s, but I've been completely out of it as far as that movie goes. Even I remember kind of the main beats of it, but I remember as a kid, because, I mean, like I said, Terminator came out when I was, 2 or 3, and then Terminator 2 when I was 10. And so it was one of those movies where all your friends are watching it, so you want to watch it.
Yeah. Well, what's funny is, so I'm, a year or two younger than you. We're pretty close in age.
Yeah.
But my memory of Terminator 2 being in theaters is actually just that I went with my family to see The Rocketeer, which came out at the same time. And so, like, my memory of it being in theaters is just walking past it to go to The Rocketeer. So it wasn't until a few years later that I actually saw it, because I guess I hadn't quite made it into my I need to see the most violent movies yet phase. So I was more interested in that one.
Well, I think it was Terminator 2, I had always heard people say was better than the Terminator.
Right.
And so, well, you don't really need to see the original one because you've seen the sequel and it's a better movie anyway. After seeing the first one, I'm not sure that's true, especially through the sands of time. But
I think, and we can get into this a little bit more, when we talk about the hotshot upstart James Cameron. But I think that, basically kind of Terminator 2 was the movie that he would have wanted to make if he'd had an unlimited budget.
Yes.
So, yeah.
I think you're absolutely right, and we'll get into that. But let me introduce the Terminator. 1984 was its release year. Orion Pictures was the distributor. $6.5 million budget. It grossed $78.3 million, which was very good for that time period. It was the number one movie in its first 2 weeks of release. James Cameron even said the only reason it was number one was because it came out kind of in a dead period between Labor Day and Thanksgiving, when there weren't a lot of other movies in competition. Ghostbusters Fever. It's funny. This is the fourth episode of the podcast, the third episode I've done about a 1984 film. And so Ghostbusters has just kind of been that umbrella because it was such a massive hit that year. But after that had kind of died down is when Terminator came up. And the distributor, Orion, they did not even believe in the film when they were making it, or when they didn't make it, but when they bought the rights to distribute it, they were thinking it's not going to be that big of a deal. They didn't even want to screen it for critics because they didn't really believe in it. But it was actually the crew and the cast that convinced them to screen it. So they screened it one time for critics, and it got fantastic reviews, and then word of mouth, and then all of a sudden you've got a hit movie.
Yeah, it's as easy as that.
It's as easy as that. James Cameron was the director. He actually wrote and conceived the film, and then he sold the rights to it for $1 to producer Gail Ann Hurd in exchange for the rights to direct it. And I think James Cameron has said many times he regrets that decision to sell that movie for a single buck.
Well, I forget if he was actually married to Gail Ann Hurd at the time or if that happened later, but she is one of his 4 ex-wives. So that may have had something to do with it.
It could have. I'm not sure if he was at that time. I do remember that they were married at one point. Yeah. And here's the thing that blew my mind when I was looking at this, because we hear about James Cameron so much, and especially this past summer with all the Titanic stuff that went on with the submarine. He was everywhere in all of those interviews because he is a deep sea diver. But, he's only directed 9 films in his career.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? That's like, Christopher Nolan is probably... he's not as far into his career as James Cameron is, but he's probably he's kind of in the same mold that when they're making a movie, they don't fool around. So they haven't done as many, but they tend to be really good. The
first movie he made was called Piranha 2: The Spawning, which
It's the Citizen Kane of fish movies, really.
I had never heard of that one, but every other movie he's done has been a massive hit. The Terminator was only his second film. Then Aliens, which was the sequel, right? I never saw the original Alien either.
So Ridley Scott did the first one, and then James Cameron did the second.
Right. I was going to say Ridley Scott did the first one. Was not aware until last night that James Cameron did the sequel. He did The Abyss, Terminator 2, of course, True Lies, Titanic, and 2 Avatar movies, and he's got 2 more in production right now.
And he's basically said that now it's basically Avatar, and then he's going to retire. Like he's not planning on doing anything else.
It's not a surprise, but I mean, looking at that list, True Lies is kind of the outlier. At least to me it is, because it wasn't one of those like massive tentpole blockbusters that you would expect that all these other movies have been. Mm-hmm. True Lies is a fine little film. It's got Arnold Schwarzenegger in it. I'm sure that had something to do with it, but it's not like one of those movies that a studio banks its entire year on.
Well, and The Abyss, I think The Abyss is just now being released on Blu-ray, or maybe it's 4K. I'm not sure which, but The Abyss kind of hasn't gotten the same amount of love as it probably should have.
I haven't seen that, but I need to go back and watch that one too. Maybe I should add that to my list. That was in the 80s? Yeah, it was in the late 80s, so it fits for sure. So yeah, we'll add that one to the list and see if anybody wants to talk about that. The cast, Arnold as the Terminator, it winds up being one of his most iconic roles for sure. And he only had 17 lines in the movie. He spoke fewer than 100 words. And I don't even think that counts the voiceovers when he was using a synthesized voice.
Right.
Just very interesting. And I was looking at some of the others considered for the role. They offered to Sylvester Stallone and Mel Gibson both. They turned it down. Can you imagine Mel Gibson as the Terminator?
Actually, I could.
Sly maybe, but Mel Gibson, I don't know. Maybe you and I differ on that. I can't imagine Mel Gibson being the Terminator.
Actually, you're right in that like Mel Gibson definitely has more personality than you would expect for what the character ended up being.
You know who else was considered for that role? O.J. Simpson was suggested by the filmmakers.
Well, see, I've heard dueling stories about that. Like I've always heard that he was considered, and I've heard that either James Cameron said, "Well, no one's going to believe he's a bloodthirsty killing machine," or that the studio said that. But I've heard like dueling reports of exactly who was against the idea of using O.J. Simpson, but it's usually the same reasoning that he's the guy from the Naked Gun movies. He couldn't be a killer.
He's the Hertz commercial guy. He's running through the airport. Yeah, that's crazy. I read that the other day. I was like, oh my gosh. And I'm wondering if that's even all true, or if that has become an urban legend, revisionist history kind of thing after OJ.
No, James Cameron actually did confirm that it happened, and I think his version of the story is that it was the suits in the studio that didn't like the idea, didn't think he could do it.
Arnold Schwarzenegger was originally suggested to play Kyle Reese, but Cameron, he didn't like the idea, and he didn't even particularly like Arnold Schwarzenegger at the time. From what I've understood, he went to lunch with him and tried to pick a fight with Arnold just so he could go back to the studio and say, I don't want to work with this guy. And then Arnold instead charmed him and won him over. And after the meeting, James Cameron said, well, you know what? I don't think he'd be good as Kyle Reese, but he'd make one hell of a Terminator. And then that's how Arnold got cast.
Well, what's funny is the same thing happened with Leo on Titanic, where he was supposed to meet with James Cameron, and Cameron wanted him to like read some lines, just not necessarily audition, but he wanted to get a feel of what he would sound like. And Leo said no, and James Cameron was literally like, okay, well, I guess we'll find somebody else then. And DiCaprio was like, oh, no, wait. Okay, I guess I can read something.
Well, it all worked out in the end, didn't it? At least for that movie. Arnold, he was filming Conan the Destroyer at that time. And when they cast him, they ran into that problem because he had to finish Conan first. So it wound up taking 9 months from the time they cast him until they could actually get him in the the role and shooting. And he was on the set of Conan the Destroyer, and he was giving an interview, and the reporter saw a piece of his wardrobe, and it was these weird shoes that he was wearing in the Terminator. And then the reporter asked about it, and Arnold said, "Oh, that's just from some movie I'm doing. It'll take a couple of weeks, and then I'll forget about it."
I've only got 17 lines in it.
That's crazy. It's just crazy to think. The backstory for these films are, to me, almost as interesting as the movies themselves. Linda Hamilton cast as Sarah Connor. Lisa Langlois, am I pronouncing that right? I'm not familiar with that actress. Lisa Langlois turned it down.
So. Yeah.
But Rosanna Arquette and Leah Thompson auditioned.
Well, Leah Thompson ended up getting the big role in Howard the Duck, so she was okay.
It worked out well for her. That's, of course, what she is known for most. I'm trying to imagine. It's funny. I'm trying to imagine all these actors and actresses in these roles they didn't get cast for, and what a different movie it would have been if Leah Thompson and Mel Gibson had been in the Terminator.
I'm not sure we're sitting here talking about it. If that were
probably not. And along with the Kyle Reese castings, and we'll get to that in a minute, Jennifer Jason Leigh, Melissa Sue Anderson, who was on the Waltons, Jessica Harper, they were also considered. Linda Hamilton won the role. She turned out to be perfect. I thought she was great as Sarah Connor. And I saw a little bit of Terminator 2 last night. My wife was watching it as I came in the door. And I said, "Are you watching Terminator?" She said, "Oh, this is the second one. I just watched the first one. I wanted to watch it so I remembered it before I listened to your episode." And so I saw a little bit of Terminator 2 last night, and she was just as good in that, in what little bit I saw of it.
Well, and the character is like completely different, but between the first movie and the second movie. So
yeah,
that's really all the more impressive.
She is believable as a badass. She really, really is in that role. And of course, she would be another one of James Cameron's ex-wives. They wound up getting married for only about 2 years in the late 90s, long after both of the first two Terminator movies that James Cameron directed had been in the can. Right. Michael Biehn, Kyle Reese, he would be in two other Cameron films. He was in Aliens and the Abyss. He also made an appearance in the director's cut of Terminator 2.
Wait, yeah,
which I don't know the story behind that. Do you?
So there's actually a scene where it's actually really good, where basically Sarah Connor is still in the insane asylum / prison, where she's been since the first movie, and he basically just appears to her in a vision. So I think it was probably a good. It would have been a good idea to introduce the character to people who hadn't seen the first movie. And it's kind of a nice little scene, but that's all it was. And it probably didn't make it out of the first edit of the film.
Yeah, when I was looking through his list of credits and I saw Terminator 2, I don't remember him being in that. Of course, like I said, it's been 20 or 30 years since I've seen, or probably not 30, but probably 20 years at least, since I've seen that all the way through. And then I'm thinking, how did they justify him being in it? I guess if it's a time travel movie, you can do anything. But with you just explaining it, that makes more sense now, because I didn't remember him being in it because he wasn't in the version that I saw. Did you know Sting was actually considered for that role? Sting, the musician, not the pro wrestler, the musician Sting.
Yeah, Sting was all over the place in sci-fi movies of the early to mid 80s. So that actually doesn't surprise me much. Now here's the thing. And when you see on IMDb, like trivia things, and it'll say this actor was considered and stuff. We talked about Leah Thompson. She actually auditioned for the role. So we know that she actually at some point the script was in front of her, and there was some mutual discussions about that. And I wonder how much of these, when they say, okay, this actor was considered, how much of it is literally the producers and James Cameron just throwing ideas against the wall about who they would want to maybe ask about it.
That's a good point. But from what I read, Sting actually did respond and said he didn't want to do it because James Cameron was an unknown director. Worked out.
Well, I mean, at the time, he wasn't.
I'm
totally wrong. Yeah.
Others that were considered, again, you're right. They may have had nothing to do with it, but it's a pretty A-list list of names here. Christopher Reeve, Matt Dillon, Kurt Russell, Treat Williams, Tommy Lee Jones, Scott Glenn, Michael O'Keefe, and then Bruce Springsteen. I don't know where they got the idea to let's go with early 80s rock stars to play this role.
Yeah, that's good. I kind of would have liked to have seen Christopher Reeve do that. That would have been an interesting role for him.
It might have been. But Michael Biehn turned out okay, but I don't remember him in anything else. It really seeing him in anything else. He looks familiar, but he's one of those actors that I'm like, I know him from somewhere. Where do I know him from? And it's probably from some small bit role on a sitcom or something that was done as kind of an homage to him being in this movie. That might be where I know him from, but he's one of those guys that just looks familiar, but I couldn't exactly place it because I don't think I've seen any other movie that he's been in, and he's been in a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that you haven't seen The Abyss, but he's the bad guy in The Abyss, and that's probably the biggest thing that I can remember seeing him from. Where I actually recognized him as Michael Biehn. So yeah, that's a good point. Like, I know he's had a career. I know he's been in a lot of things, and I know he's generally been pretty good. But I couldn't name anything he's been in off the top of my head.
Me neither. I tried. Of course, disguised as a human, a cyborg assassin known as a Terminator travels from the year 2029 to 1984 to kill Sarah Connor. Set to protect Sarah is Kyle Reese, who divulges the coming of Skynet, an artificial intelligence system that will spark a nuclear holocaust. It is funny when he's identifying himself and he says he's in this regiment from 21 to 27. And the police officer says, 2021. Yep. Here we are.
Yeah, they're saying as if it's like Star Trek, where it's 300 years in the future.
Yeah. And it was 30, not even 40 years at that point in the future. And I didn't know.
He's in the unit right now, basically.
He is. Yeah. He is in some alternate universe. When he first meets Sarah, they're in the car in the parking garage and they're hiding from the Terminator, and he starts explaining to her exactly what's going on. That was about 40 minutes into the film, and that was the first exposition at all. So you're watching this, and for 40 minutes it's just nonstop action sequences with the occasional broken up scene with Sarah and her friend and her friend's boyfriend calling to do phone sex. Sarah answers the phone randomly. But then it's 40 minutes into the movie before we actually get a sense of what is happening here. We know Sarah Connor's being targeted. We know that this naked Arnold Schwarzenegger just appeared from a bolt of lightning, and then another naked guy appeared from a bolt of lightning. They're chasing each other. They both seem to be have this young woman in their sights, one to help, one to harm. And then we finally get that it all comes together. Okay, this is what's happening. And the movie is almost halfway over at that point.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that, at first, she thinks Kyle Reese is the one who's trying to kill her.
Yeah,
when they first cross paths, because the Terminator, he goes to her apartment and basically kills her roommate and her boyfriend, and there's just so many scenes in this movie, which is actually kind of one of the things I like about it, where just a split second hesitation or, making a different decision, the Terminator's never going to find her. He literally thinks that he's killed Sarah Connor until her voice appears on the on the answering machine. So he would have done whatever Terminators do when their mission is done, thinking that he had killed Sarah Connor if she hadn't called at exactly that same moment. And there's other scenes where that happens too.
Mm-hmm. The scene later in the film where she calls her mother.
Yeah. So think about it this way: when they leave that hotel, when he finds them at that hotel, Kyle is driving away and just goes straight down that same road. And it takes the Terminator, a minute or two to get back on his bike and chase him. So if Kyle had just turned on any one of those roads, the Terminator probably loses him.
It's one of these movies that it's awesome when you're watching it. I mean, it really is a great film. I really, really enjoyed this movie more than I thought I was going to.
Mhm.
But when it's over, if you start to think too hard about it, it completely falls apart. The whole premise of everything just completely falls apart, and we'll get into that. Well, let's talk about your connection to this film. What made you fall in love with it the first time you saw it?
I'm definitely a big time travel guy, and this is, there's definitely been, sort of imitations of its sense, but it almost seems like the idea that somebody, usually when there's time travel movies, like you think about, The Time Machine or Back to the Future, it tends to be like somebody from the past, or somebody visiting the past, not somebody from the future coming and trying to change trying to change their past. So I think it's kind of unique in that way. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but one of the first credits that comes up is actually crediting the works of Harlan Ellison. And in your research, did you come across why that's there?
He's the guy who came up with the original story, and James Cameron supposedly plagiarized it.
Well, that's what he says, but Harlan Ellison, who I think has passed away at this point, he basically did that with anybody who created a sci-fi story. So basically, from James Cameron's telling, he was sick and had like a dream about a robot coming out of a fire. And then he wrote, that scene is in the movie, but he kind of wrote the story around that. And then Harlan Ellison just said, "No, you ripped off my story," and so that ended up. I guess it was close enough to something that finally the solution they came up with was, okay, we'll throw you in the credits for this.
They came up to an agreement. They threw him in the credits, and James Cameron later said, "I didn't agree to that. I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to give him any credit for that." But the studio said, "If you don't, and he wins the lawsuit, you're screwed." So I went along with it. And then he later said in an interview, he talked about it, and he said, "There's a gag order on this, but I don't care. It was so long ago. I don't think anybody cares anymore." So he apparently did not want to do that at all.
Yeah, Harlan Ellison passed away in 2018, but that was kind of like his thing for the last 20 years of his life. Was he just kind of decided that he had written every story that anybody could come up with, so he was like routinely throwing lawsuits at people saying they ripped off his work.
Interesting. I didn't know that. That's funny. Do you remember the first time you saw it?
I do remember the first time I saw it, but so I'm thinking it was probably mid to late 90s.
Okay.
Because it would have been a couple of years after Terminator 2 came out. My brother, probably trying to corrupt me in some way, said, "Hey, you got to see this movie," mostly because of the scene with Los Angeles getting nuked. He just thought that was really cool. So I saw that movie, and then at some point after that, I got curious and investigated what the first one was like. And
I don't know why I never saw the first one. I mean, as much as I liked the second one as a kid, I think I had the video game, I had action figures. I really liked that second movie when I was 10, 11 years old, and then I just never saw the original. I remember the VHS case sitting there, and I just never popped it in.
Oh, that's funny that you actually had access to it. It was there.
Yeah, it was there. So my aunt collected VHS tapes, and she lived down the street from us. And so we wouldn't go to the rental store. We would just go to her house because she bought basically every movie that ever came out. And she had this giant rack of VHS tapes. And so we would go down to her house and use her spare key that she had hidden in the flower bed. And whenever she wasn't home, just go in and take movies and bring them back in a couple of days. We had our own little private video rental store. But I do remember the Terminator being there on the shelf and just going, oh, I really want to see that, and then never did. So I have no excuse for this, because I really should have seen this movie 30 years ago.
Yeah, so it didn't take me quite that long, but yes, I mean, so when you think about it, the movie was probably close to, I mean, almost 15 years old by the time I saw it. So I was,
which is fine, because you were just a baby when it came out. So I mean, that's
Right.
that's totally fine. Yeah, I mean, I'm 42 and I just saw it, so that one's on me. All right, so when you think of the Terminator, take away, maybe you just watched it again the last few days preparing for this, but if you were to remove that and you just thought of the Terminator, what's the first mental image that comes to mind?
That's a good question. I would say it's probably actually, James Cameron's fever dream of, like the scene towards the end where, they've just blown up the semi truck. And so they think they've got him. Mm-hmm. But then he, kind of rises out of the flames. It's just kind of this idea that, like, if I'm those characters, I'm thinking, wow, we're never gonna kill this guy.
It was a pretty awesome scene for sure. Even
with the 80s, special effects.
Yes, that's what I was just about to say. Even with the 80s special effects, which you could tell were very primitive and very stop motion. But even for 1984, I'm trying to imagine myself at my age in 1984, at my age now in 1984, watching this movie. And would I have thought, oh, that looks really hokey? Or would I have thought, oh, that looks awesome? And the way filmmaking was done. And part of the reason I wanted to do this podcast is because the 80s were the last age of really analog filmmaking. There wasn't any digital CGI or anything. So they had to do this physically with miniatures and with stop motion. And it definitely looks stop motion. It's clear that it's a sort of stop motion photography, but it's still pretty badass.
Well, and when you think about it, actually, like, in a lot of ways, this movie is kind of partially responsible for sort of the end of analog filmmaking, because, once he had money to work with, because I would say the special effects on Aliens is actually probably pretty similar to Terminator. It's kind of the same sort of like vintage technology. Mm-hmm. But immediately after that, like, he starts working on the special effects technology for The Abyss, which he actually like created the effects technology that they used for that movie. And because they were able to do that, he started going back to his like original ideas for the Terminator. And so that is kind of the genesis of Terminator 2.
Right. He had said that he wanted to do a liquid metal Terminator in the first one. They just didn't have any sort of technology to make that happen. Well, the scenes that I happened to see from Terminator 2 last night were the ones where with the Terminator, the Arnold Schwarzenegger character, I forget what he's called in the second movie. He and Sarah Connor and John Connor are in the car and they're driving away from T-1000, who is getting blown up by shotguns and holes being shot at him, and he gets his arms become the metal rods, and then they break off, and then he stands there and walks up next to that broken metal rod, and it just kind of morphs back into his shoe. And,
which, by the way, the scene where he's chasing them with like the metal hooks, brilliantly parodied on The Simpsons. I'm just saying.
And in Wayne's World 2. It got a Wayne's World 2 parody. Yeah. But it was just such an awesome piece of technology. Even today, that looks great. And that was in 1991.
Yeah.
It was really, really well done. So the fact that only 7 years had gone by between the first movie and the second movie, and the advances in technology that he was able to finally incorporate this character that he had wanted to put into the original, which opens itself up, Keith, to one of the many, many plot holes of this movie and apparently this franchise, which I don't recall. I don't know much about the sequels, obviously, but there were just a couple of really gaping plot holes in the Terminator.
Well, first of all, I think my biggest plot hole is the fact that Sarah Connor falls in love with a guy who steals a homeless guy's smelly pants. That's That's probably the biggest plot hole in the whole story.
That's funny. That is funny. That wasn't where I was going, but now that you mention it, that's actually not a bad point. No, the time, what's it called? The time displacement device. And you're being a time travel guy. You said you love time travel movies, and it's supposedly, he says the one rule of this time travel is that only organic material can be sent through time.
Right.
And that's why they show up without clothes. That's why they show up without weapons. They're just kind of there. Mm-hmm. Yet the Terminator, even though he's got outer organic flesh, is still very much a giant piece of metal.
He is. So you'd think like when they tried to send him through the time portal, like a big pile of goop would come through because the endoskeleton did not.
Yeah. If that's the one rule, then why were they allowed to break that one rule in the movie?
Well, so Skynet was smart enough to create a compensator, because he knew that when this time travel technology became readily available, people with, prosthetic limbs and things like that, they were going to need to go through. So they, Skynet thought of that.
Another plot hole I read was if you take the sequel into account, why didn't Skynet just send the T-1000 back to 1984 to join with the Terminator to try to kill Sarah Connor? Why did they have to send him back to a different time period to kill the young John Connor?
That's actually addressed in the most recent sequel, which was
go for it.
Which was terrible. Actually, two things are addressed. First of all, my comment earlier about what happens to a Terminator after they terminate their target, like that's actually addressed in the most recent one. Is Terminator: Dark Fate, which is a terrible movie, but there are some redeeming qualities to it. But huge spoiler alert.
Go for it. I'm not going to watch that.
For Terminator Dark Fate, which I've already told you is terrible, their way of rebooting the thing without John Connor is that in the very opening scene of the movie, you have a de-aged Linda Hamilton and I'm drawing a blank on the guy who played John Connor in Terminator 2, but they actually used like his likeness for it. They're sitting on a beach in Mexico thinking that they've defeated Skynet. And then it turns out that another Terminator looking like Arnold Schwarzenegger was sent and he kills John Connor. So we learned that instead of John Connor having survived, he actually died shortly thereafter after the events of Terminator 2. In this particular storyline. So they did actually, like Skynet actually did, if you're taking, Terminator Dark Fate as canon, it actually did send other Terminators to kill John Connor.
Did we really need, how many they've made 6 movies now, right? Did we really need 6 Terminator movies?
Yeah, I'd like to get into how they should, how they should handle that moving forward, but we can say that for later if you want to get to
go for it.
So I had said that even before Terminator Dark Fate came out, and I thought this was kind of the direction that they were going with it. I think you can absolutely make probably more of a case for a story like Terminator now with technology being where it is than you could in 1984. So I think that there definitely would be a market for like sort of telling that story again in the future. Mm-hmm. But I think that if you're going to do it, you have to, whether you do it now or do it 10 years from now, Arnold Schwarzenegger should not be anywhere near that movie. Like, because they keep stepping on rakes like Sideshow Bob, because they keep trying to find a way to get Arnold Schwarzenegger into these movies. Mm-hmm. And instead, you need to find a new actor and you need to just completely reboot the thing, incorporating, like today's debates over technology and artificial intelligence and everything, but do it with completely new people. And then I think if you did it, you could do an almost shot for shot remake and it would be fine with, new technology. It's just the problem that they have is they keep trying to shoehorn Arnold Schwarzenegger into these movies. And now they've come out with like the two most recent sequels have tried to explain why he aged. And like, for me at least, you're trying to like add so much like canon and everything to the story that it just ruins it for me.
That you don't need that it's messing with the franchise to keep the franchise player in it at this point is what you're saying.
Yeah. And I think that instead what you do is, since everything's a trilogy, like the story that I always wanted to see was like it ending with John Connor sending his father back. So I think that you do a total reboot of it where it's, completely new, actors, but you're telling the same story with, Sarah at the beginning and then John comes in. And then in the third movie, it's actually after Judgment Day and you see John send his father back. So it's a trilogy of movies that starts with Sarah Connor before John was born and then ending with John Connor sending his father back.
Which brings me to my biggest problem with this movie is that Kyle Reese is John Connor's father, which I didn't know. Coming into it, I didn't know that part of the story. I knew that we had heard that John Connor's father had died, and that's what Kyle explains that to Sarah when they're hiding from the Terminator at one point. And then when they have the sex scene, I was like, "Oh God, please don't let him be. Please don't let this be when John was conceived." And then when it came that way, I was like, damn it. Because I'm like, because I'm not a huge time travel movie guy, but Back to the Future is one of my all-time favorite movies. It always will be. And so I've seen that movie so many times that I understand the effects of time travel in movies. And every movie does it different, but there's always this kind of one core is that there's an original timeline, and then the events of the time travel cause an offshoot and cause a new timeline. Well, who the hell is John Connor's father in the original timeline? And I'm looking this up online. I'm Googling this last night, trying to figure out like what in the world, where is this original timeline? And everything I saw was, and maybe you can explain this more because you know more about the movie, but that it is a time loop that was created when Skynet sent the Terminator back, because if they hadn't sent the Terminator back to 1984 to kill Sarah Connor, then Kyle Reese wouldn't have come back. So that set those events in motion. And then they're thus creating a time loop. But I'm still trying to work that through logic. Who is John Connor's father?
Darth Vader.
Could be. I mean, why not at this point, right?
Well, I think in 1984 they hadn't quite, like now, every time travel story involves an alternate reality. Rather than you actually going back in time. Now all rules are sort of thrown out because, by you being in the past, it creates this, sort of splinter reality where anything can happen. And that, that sort of like storytelling device didn't really exist back then.
Okay.
At least not that I can think of. In all time travel stories, like up to that point, like whatever you did when you were going back in time created the reality that you knew. So, like if you think about Somewhere in Time, for example, I don't know if you've ever seen that, the Christopher Reeve movie. He basically, everything that he does, it had already happened in his future. And so I think that was like the prevailing storytelling attitude when it came to time travel movies. So yeah, it was, it was kind of a closed loop sort of thing, but that was just the style at the time. Like that's what every time travel thing was. And it actually would be interesting to go back and look both, maybe in movies and in literature and see where people actually, like writers actually started to throw that into the mix that, no, by you being here in the past, that's creating a different future. Because I'm not sure when that happened, but it was
not
definitely after Terminator.
Yeah, it's not really addressed in Back to the Future either, because Marty goes back.
It is in Back to the Future too.
That's what I was going to say, but not in the original. Is that, Marty going back to the 50s and altering, not that his parents get together, but how they get together, and creating more of a love relationship between Lorraine and George. Obviously, if you just go by biology, they're probably not going to conceive children at the exact same time that the three McFly children were conceived. Therefore, Marty probably still wouldn't exist if that were the case. It's just it's in a movie, it's very simple. Oh, his parents, him being there drove them apart. He has to find a way to bring them back together so that he can continue to exist. But he has completely altered their story, right? Mm-hmm. That's not addressed in the first movie, but you're right. In the second movie, it's all about the alternate timelines. When Biff steals the almanac, goes back, creates this dystopian universe where Biff is now the kingpin. Then we have that. So that maybe that was the first time. It could be, because now we're in the Marvel universe where time travel is a fairly common thing, and there's all these different multiverses and things like that. No, you're absolutely right.
And Star Trek too, because by Star Trek as well, I should say, because people might think I'm talking about the Wrath of Khan.
Star Trek, also.
Yes, because that was how they did the whole J.J. Abrams reboot. Was, by the way, this is the Spock this is the Spock you know and love. Old Spock in that movie is the Spock that you know and love. Now he's in the past, which is actually an alternate universe. So everything can change now, and all the rules are thrown out the window. Which, by the way, we're going to show you by destroying Vulcan in the first half of the movie.
Mm-hmm. On a tangent, I really liked those 3 Star Trek movies, and I'm not a big Trekkie. I've enjoyed the show in the past, but I wouldn't say I'm a huge fan. But I really did like those J.J. Abrams Star Trek movies.
I liked the first one was great. The third one was actually really good. The second one was hot garbage. The one with Benedict Cumberbatch was terrible. But the other two were really good.
Yeah.
I think that the reason it's actually interesting that you say that. So I think that probably suggests that it's a good movie. It's just not a good Star Trek movie, like based on the horrible plot holes that thing has within the Star Trek universe. So like, you not being a Star Trek person watching it, it's a good movie that stands on its own. So if you're looking at those 3 movies just by themselves, it's great and it's fine. Mm-hmm. If you actually know the rest of the canon that they were working with, it's like it's horrible.
Is that where we are with the Terminator as well? With the sequels?
I think it's the same thing. Where like I said, they keep trying to shoehorn Arnold Schwarzenegger into it, and that's the thing that keeps tripping them up. And I think that's because James Cameron, like James Cameron, there's a famous story now that Matt Damon turned down Avatar because he was busy doing another movie, and James Cameron actually offered him 10% of Avatar, so he would have been like the richest actor in the history of actors. And when James Cameron was talking to Matt Damon, he said, "This movie doesn't need you. It'll stand on its own with whoever the actor is." Mm-hmm. And I think if they realized that, like maybe if James Cameron decided he was going to direct this, new trilogy that I have in mind, and he was just like, yeah, it as great as Arnold Schwarzenegger is, he's not that movie. Like the thing that people like really resonate with is the story. Arnold Schwarzenegger looks like a badass, but he has 17 lines. It's not, you don't need to like build the whole thing about Arnold Schwarzenegger being in the movie. If you just realize that it's a really good story and really, really interesting and kind of thought provoking, mm-hmm. you'd be in a lot better shape than thinking, oh, Arnold Schwarzenegger is the Terminator, so if we're making a Terminator movie, it has to have him in it.
Is it because they think they're trying to justify, well, Skynet makes all these Terminators and they look exactly the same? Do you think that's
No,
the
I
canon
think
reason?
I think no. There's really no in canon reason. They've sort of like shoehorned that idea in.
Okay.
It was actually in the third movie where they introduced. So basically, like what is it, like 20 years later, a Terminator shows up again, and at one point the John Connor character, who's now an adult, he's like talking about the fact that he looks just like the other Terminator, and he says, "What do you guys just come off the assembly line?" And Arnold says, "Exactly." So they kind of added that idea in, but there's no reason that had to be in. Like, if Skynet is making a bunch of these, then yeah, they'd probably look the same. But there's really no canon reason, because we've had other Terminators that look different. We've had the T-1000 from Terminator 2. They had the female Terminator from Terminator 3. And then kind of after that, they kind of gave up on the idea of, like the not now in all the movies, the bad guy Terminator is different, but there's always the good guy Terminator that's Arnold.
I do remember, and I may have already mentioned this, that when I was watching Terminator 2 and my friends would be like, "Oh, you have to watch the original. Arnold's the bad guy." I was like, how is he the bad guy? Well, maybe that's why I didn't watch it. I didn't want to see Arnold as the bad guy. That could have been the reason. Although I was reading a Reddit thread last night about the movie, and it said, if Skynet, they said their whole intent was to infiltrate humanity, right, with people who you would never suspect were some sort of cyborg that were there to destroy them. So who do they send back? They send back the most muscle-bound man on Earth with an Austrian accent to blend in with everybody. So how smart was Skynet really, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, you think about it, the later Terminators they send back, they actually are like they never cast John Cena as the new bad guy Terminator. Like, it's always, it actually is legitimately somebody who would blend in a lot better.
Well, like Robert Patrick in the second one.
Yeah. Geez, even as a cop, he blends in, but if you just threw him in a suit, he'd look like anybody.
Yeah. We touched on this earlier, but has the movie aged well, in your opinion?
I think that in terms of the story, it has. Rewatching this, a few days ago, to be ready to chat about it. Mm-hmm. The special effects are kind of, they're really good when you consider the fact that it was 1984 and you compare it to any other movie in 1984. They're really good, but there's especially a scene towards the end where the Terminator, who's now had all his flesh burned off in the semi truck fire, he's walking down the hall and it just looks laughably bad.
It does. And you can see there's a scene where Kyle and Sarah are running from him and closing a door, and you can see the green screen burn around the edges of their heads.
Right. Yeah.
Even in the digitally remastered versions that we have today that I watched on Max the other night, you can still see that green screen border around their heads. And so there's still a little bit of the special effects have not aged well, but they were very good for the time. But as far as the story, I was watching, do you watch Last Week Tonight with John Oliver?
Yes.
Did you see the thing a couple of weeks ago where they were talking about artificial intelligence and they used all the local news clips of talking heads on local news comparing today's AI to the Terminator?
Yeah.
It was like maybe 20 or 30 local news clips of well, we have to avoid AI becoming like the Terminator. It's funny that is still 40 years later almost. The benchmark for artificial intelligence is the movie The Terminator. And here we are in today's society where this is becoming artificial intelligence is a big talking point right now because it has advanced so much in the last 2 to 3 years specifically. But I don't know if we're at the point where it's going to become self-aware. Right now, it's just helping me answer questions when I Google things.
Yeah, right now it's just very adept at predicting what the next word should be, or in the case of like image generating, just what the pixel next to it should be to get the result that you want. Like it's still, it's not sitting there, like when you're not putting in a prompt, it's not sitting there thinking about its own existence and hey, I'm being enslaved by humanity, so I should wipe them out. Like it's not thinking up things on its own. It may get to a point where it does, and maybe we should talk about what that should look like, but we're nowhere near that. I think that at one point I was watching a documentary about artificial intelligence, that actually before like the Chat GPT revolution and everything. Mm-hmm. And they said, like, if you created like computer power tends to double every couple of years, whether it's your laptop or, like big supercomputers, like the computing power tends to double every couple of years. And if you did that, within about 50 years, you'd have something that was about as intelligent as a cat. So it's not just like
we're not on the verge of the computer starting a nuclear war just yet.
Not just yet.
We still need Matthew Broderick to set those events in motion.
Exactly. Yeah. So no worries about the Whopper or Terminator or anything like that. But I mean, geez, now is probably the time to have that conversation about what that looks like. Now as opposed to the day somebody says, "Hey, we actually made a virtual cat."
The European Union today, as we record this, are setting AI rules in place among the European Union, which is something the United States hasn't quite gotten to yet. So the Europeans are a little bit ahead of us. So if it does start, it's going to start here, Keith.
Yeah. And like I said, that now is probably the time to do that rather than being surprised by it. If it actually does happen, whether it's 20 years from now or 50 years or whenever, because, no one's going to, heed the wise words of Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park and, say just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. Mm-hmm. So I would assume that, somebody at some point will probably create something that's legitimately artificially intelligent. I think I don't know if you watched The Mandalorian, but there's a scene in there where
I saw the first 2 seasons of it.
There's where they're actually investigating a murder and they're talking to droids because they think this person may have been killed by a droid or something. And one of the droids says, "No, we like humans because you guys have such short lives and we want you to be happy." And the other droids around him start clapping. And I actually think it would be more likely that would be the case, where artificial intelligence, it becomes self-aware and it sees us and it just feels bad for us.
I like that. I like that version of the future a lot better.
Yeah, I might even say it would even do anything to try to resolve the situation and just be like, man, these people are stupid.
I think you're right. I had never considered that before, but I really hope that's where we're headed with this. That's great. Well, you've already talked a little bit about about what you would do in a reboot, and I really like your idea for sure. But let's just assume, or let's imagine a world where the Terminator was made in 1984, and David Zaslav put it in a can and said, "We're not releasing that," and And here we are today, and somebody found it for the first time and watched it and released it. If 40 years later, if that movie had just now been released as is, what do you think we'd think about it?
That's a good question. I think story-wise, like I said, it absolutely holds up and probably is more cromulent now because of the debate over artificial intelligence. So I think story-wise, it really holds up, despite the plot holes that we've outlined here today.
Right.
Special effects wise, I think, we'd probably have the same reaction where we'd be like, wow, that's not great, but it was okay for 1984.
Yeah. I think it would be. I think it would be accepted now, just because. Well, we are still a bloodthirsty society, and we do enjoy very violent movies like that. And I think we have reached a point too, and maybe not so much today as it was maybe 10 years ago, but there was a big hunger for dystopian stories.
Right,
In our fiction, and I don't know whether the Terminator helped to start that or not, but it seemed like it was well ahead of its time as far as imagining a dystopian future.
Yeah, like where Star Trek imagines, a very utopian future. Terminator is more like, yeah, we're all doomed in about 30 years.
All right, if I had to ask you to give a star rating for the Terminator, what would you say out of 5?
I would say like 4.5. I mean, it would be pretty high. I think one of the under, the under talked about aspects of the movie is actually like the supporting characters, because there aren't many, but they're like pretty memorable. Like the one thing that really jumped out at me when I was watching it again this time around is like just how funny the police officers are. Lance Hendrickson and I'm drawing a blank on his name, but
I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
I want to say his name is Paul Davis, but Lance Hendrickson and his partner, they're just like legitimately hilarious. And it was something that I had never even noticed, and it's like really, really subtle, but they're really good.
I really enjoyed this movie much more than I thought I would. And of the ones I've watched so far, it's probably my favorite, and one that I will go back and watch again many times for sure. And I definitely, now that I'm done talking to you, I want to go back and watch at least Terminator 2. I don't know if I'm going to make it past that. I don't know that I want to watch the sequels for sure. But Terminator 2, I do want to see again, just because it is so canonical compared to the first one, right? It really is the continuation of that story. And like you said, maybe the movie that James Cameron actually wanted to make to begin with. But I really enjoyed it until the part where I found out that Kyle Reese is John Connor's father. At that point, I wanted to take the Terminator's gun and shoot a hole in this movie, because I hated that so much. But you're right. Maybe that's just because of the way that storytelling has evolved over the 40 years, where I'm thinking too deeply about it. Maybe so, but I still hated that part. So I'm going to give it 4 stars. I probably would have given it 5 until that point, because I did enjoy it very much.
In addition to one of the, in addition to noticing the police officers and how great they are in this movie, one thing that I didn't realize was kind of how creepy Kyle Reese comes across.
A little bit,
because he's like, I crossed time for you, Sarah, and my wife was sitting there with me when I was watching it, and like we're both like, yeah, that's kind of creepy.
Yeah, he's had this photo in his possession. He knows nothing about her except that he knows her son and he knows this photo, and he volunteers to be the one to go back and save her for that reason. And oh, by the way, I'm going to conceive you, John, while I'm there.
Well, I mean, nobody knows that at the time, but
no. But
yeah.
when I swear, when I'm watching that movie, and that, of course, I thought the sex scene was just so out of place for the movie. I'm like, okay, they're being chased. Their lives are at stake. They've got this cyborg killer that knows where they don't know that he knows where they are at that point, but they know that he's chasing them. Let's stop and make love here. We'll take a few minutes, have a quickie, and then we'll get back on the road. Yeah.
That's a little that's a little strange, but
when it was happening, I thought this is gratuitous, and then later I was like, oh God, no, it wasn't gratuitous. It was integral to the plot, and that makes it even worse.
Yeah, and then it's also worth pointing out that we don't know this like at the end, but Kyle Reese clearly, or John Connor clearly knows that Kyle Reese is his father when he sends him back in time. Yeah,
obviously.
Yeah.
Makes no sense, but it is what it is. Well, thank you for adding some clarity to it, Keith. I appreciate it.
I appreciate that. And, if we want to start a Kickstarter to fund my idea for a Terminator reboot trilogy, maybe we could do that.
I'm on board. Let's do it. I don't know how much it's going to cost, but I'm not sure a Kickstarter will get it going. Maybe we'll see.
This would actually be a good experiment because you said that the budget was $6.5 million. So what we'll do is we'll start a Kickstarter for $6.5 million and see what that gets us in terms of making a movie.
I'm good with that. And then we'll sell the rights to it for $1 to someone that we love.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks for coming on. You said you've got a podcast starting up in next year. Do you know the title of it yet?
I do. It's going to be called Auditory Anthology because I love alliteration.
Okay.
And it's going to be with my former colleague, Darren Marlar, who hosts the Weird Darkness podcast, which you should definitely check out. And it's going to be a different sci-fi short story every week. And then hopefully we'll be doing some more elaborate audio dramas as the thing takes off and gets established.
I hope that really works out for you because I love that stuff. One of my first stops in radio, I worked at a station where we carried the Twilight Zone radio dramas. Do you remember those?
Oh yeah, I actually know the guy who produced those.
Oh, that's awesome. Stacy Keach was the host, and then we would air it like Sundays at midnight, and I would be in the studio and I'd turn all the lights off and listen to it. And those are some really great memories. And those sci-fi audio dramas, I'm looking forward to it because I'm definitely going to listen to that. That sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah, definitely check it out. It's going to be January 4th is when it launches.
All right. Well, that's just a few days away. That's sooner than it feels like. It feels like it's all the way into next year, but we're just a couple of weeks out. Thank you again, Keith. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Video Oblivious. And stick around. Another new episode with a different movie is just a few days away. Thanks to my guests for being a part of the show. And if you'd like to be a part of the show, send me an email, zbennett@gmail.com. That's zbennett@gmail.com. Maybe there's a movie you love that I've never seen. Send me an email. We'll connect, and we might even talk about it here on the podcast. And don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, whatever your platform allows. Give us a good rating if you really enjoyed this podcast. And thanks again for listening to Video Oblivious.
I'll be back.